So I'm going to begin with this main cone mesh that I've got selected here, which we can see in the bottom left of the 3D view, cone mesh. And I'm going to come over to the Tools tab of the tool shelf, and you can either just click on these tabs here, or we can use Control and middle mouse wheel to scroll through them. And I'm just going to show that we currently have our texture or brush selected, and that just means that we can left click on our model and just lay down some paint wherever we happen to have our cursor there. So I don't want that in this case though. We want to paint our vertical gradient, so I'm just going to go Control Z to undo that, and then the brush that we're looking for is the fill brush. And what this is going to do is not a lot currently, because our texture is white and the color palette is currently white, but if we set this down to black and turn the strength all the way up so that it actually does lay down black and not sort of like a mid-gray in that instance, we can left click on the model and it's just going to fill the whole thing with black. And if we take a look down a little bit closer in the image editor, you can see it's padding it out similar to how we were baking, and it's just padding that out an extra couple of pixels. So to change that, we can come down to the options, and then where we have bleed here, it's set to 2 pixels. I'm just going to crank that up to about 8. And then if we lay down some more color again by just left clicking on the model, you can see it's going to pad that out a little bit further now. So coming back over to the Tools tab, I'm going to change that to white and then just left click again, just to basically kind of reset that, or we could use Control Z. And instead of it being just this single fill color that we're doing, we're going to use this gradient instead. And now you can see that our color palette area is kind of updated to show us a gradient. And then we also have this mode, which we want to keep on linear. That's pretty much good enough. We can now just left click and drag across the model to lay down our gradient. But I'm just going to change one more thing by changing the stroke method to line, and that way when we take a look from the front orthographic mode, we can kind of left click and drag across the model and then hold Control, and we can kind of get a little bit more of a consistent angle there. So just going straight up, I'm just going to let go at this point, and you can see we've laid down our gradient. So it's not massively easy to see exactly how that looks on the model. So I'm going to switch over to the Materials tab and then just have this as being a shadeless material. And that kind of shows us far clearer in the viewport exactly what's going on. One other thing to take note of is when we're actually painting from an orthographic view, sometimes the 3D painting isn't perfectly accurate. So to kind of help with that, we can press 5 to toggle into a perspective front mode instead, and then press N to bring up our property sidebar, and let's change our viewing lens to something really high. I think the highest we can take it is 250. And then if we just close out our tool shelves with the N and T key, we can just sort of scroll out a little bit, and it kind of much more resembles a orthographic view. And that way we can left click. So let's just take a look down here. You can see there's a couple of issues just towards the edge of this shell here where it's just still white and it hasn't painted it. So if we just left click and drag across again and hold Control, you can see it's basically filled that up a lot more consistently now. So now I'm just going to pull up the tool shelf again with the T key. Then I'm going to switch from this cone mesh to this cone base. And all we need to do that is just right click on it. And you can see now we've got the cone base mesh selected. If we just switch from object mode over to texture paint mode, you can see that it basically kind of remembers the last mode that an object was in. So if we right click on this cone mesh, you can see we have this selected now. And then if we right click on the cone base, you can see that we have this selected now, but they're both now still in texture paint mode, whereas initially the cone base was in object mode. If we go over to the camera object and select that, you can see that we get switched to an object mode again. But if we right click on our cone base, you can see now that it's remembered that we were in texture paint mode. So again, for this, I'm just going to left click and drag from the base, and then maybe stop around there while holding Control, and then let go of left click to lay down that gradient. The next thing I'm going to do is right select this camera object, and then we want to switch that over to texture paint mode. And then note that in the slots tab, we've got our camera lens selected at the moment. And you can see the camera lens normal map bake in the image editor there as it's selected here in our available paint slots. So I'm going to switch over to the cone material and then just left click on this gradient just to force the update in the image editor as well. And then from here we can just left click and drag from below, hold Control, tool, and that should lay down some paint for that area. Next, I'm going to select this sort of cable area, the camera cord section, and then switch that to be texture paint mode. So whatever of these 4 objects we select now with the right mouse button, they're always going to be in texture paint mode at this point. And this one's set to the ribbing cord material as well, so I'm going to switch that back to cone material, left click on the gradient just to force that update there, and then left click and drag across again, and that's going to lay down some more paint as our vertical gradient. So with that, I'm just going to go image and then pack as PNG and then save the blend file in just a moment. But just first, before I do that, I'm just going to take our gradient here, and then I'm just going to come down to the blend value, which is currently set to mix, and then just set that as multiply. And then if we just come back up to the top, we can kind of toggle the visibility of that gradient, and you can kind of see the effect that that's having there. If we don't want it to be quite that strong, we can just sort of reduce the color value here from 1 down to something else. So let's just make this a little bit more subtle by leaving it around something like 0.7.